Welcome to this episode of Compassionate Conversations. My name is Lynn Flanagan, and I'm the CEO with Hospice of Rockingham County. Compassionate Conversations is one more way that our organization strives to care for, support, and love the community that we serve. Joining me today are two wonderful ladies, Kerri Miller, one of our chaplains, and Christin Hunnicutt, our Grief Services Coordinator. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So, lots of things we're going to talk about today. Hopefully hit some misconceptions head on about grief and loss and bereavement. Lots of things to educate the community about. But before we jump in, Kerri,
Yes.
What would you like our listeners to know about you?
Well, I'm really glad to be here and speaking on this topic. My name is Kerri Miller, and I'm actually a half-time chaplain and a half-time grief services counselor here at Hospice of Rockingham County. I came into the hospice world from personal experience because I saw what a difference it made to have care provided versus when you don't have care provided. So it's a very personal journey for me, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Christin, what would you like the listeners to know about you?
So my name's Christin Hunnicutt. I am the Grief Services Coordinator here. I've been here about 3.5 years. I have always had a heart for serving the community, and it's no different here. Years prior, about 12 years, I actually worked at my church as a family pastor and community outreach coordinator. And so I've kind of always had a heart for the community, and that continues as I just try to bring comfort to everyone that we work with here.
Well, thank you so much. I think I just learned something that maybe I didn't know about you. That's kind of cool. So let's just start at the beginning and talk about some of the regulatory issues that that Medicare provides for us. You know, we've said on past podcasts, as we're talking about hospice care, that everything we do is regulated by Medicare. And what I mean by that is they really give us guidelines as to what services we are to provide, but they don't necessarily tell us how to provide when it comes to the bereavement end of things. But let's just talk about the length of time. What does the regulation say as far as our bereavement care and whoever chooses to go?
Sure. So the guidelines are that we provide support for 13 months. But really, like you said, that's just a guideline. That's just the minimum, and we never do the minimum.
Right.
So if we were to have any families that continued to have times that they could just use some extra support or counsel, anything comes up, you know, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, we're still here. So that really is just the minimum there.
Okay. All right.
Absolutely, and that's actually not unusual. We'd had a call a few weeks ago where someone whose parent had passed under our care 2 years ago declined bereavement support, but is realizing now that things are hard and they need a little bit of help. So they've reached back out, and we're able to be there for them now.
Awesome. So, and you know, when you think of 13 months after the death of their loved one, and you think, well, golly, I mean, that's a year and a little bit, right? But even when you look at some of the changes, I mean, we've made, even as an employer, in our own bereavement leave, especially if you've been the caregiver, you're caught up in so much of the business end of things, if you will, and things that have to get done right after the death. I would imagine that a lot of times you all hear people might not even realize what they need until you get months down the road.
Absolutely, and so oftentimes within the first 3 to 4 months, the loss still seems very surreal. It's like a piece of information. We know this happened, but we don't feel it quite yet, and there are the details and the business. But as time progresses and they realize the person's not here and life goes back to what is allegedly normal, they're trying to figure out what happens next.
That's right.
So that just led me to think, you know, we talk an awful lot in end-of-life care, how many times we hear families say, oh, if we had known you all could do so-and-so, we would have called you sooner. I just wish we would have had your support sooner. So that's talking about before their loved one passes away, right? So all of that, but that is so important, not just for the patient to have all of our support for a longer period of time, but that makes me think of what we call anticipatory grieving, and how you all might be able to provide support even before that death occurs.
Sure. So there's several times that we may get involved sooner for anticipatory support. Our social workers and chaplain, she works part-time for that. They do a fantastic, yes, they do a fantastic job with helping families with some of that anticipatory grief. But there are instances that I may come in early and provide a little bit of extra support too. You know, times where maybe there's children involved and families might have some extra concerns for those children, how to help them prepare, how to help them process everything that's happening and is going to happen. Times where maybe caregivers just could use just another listening ear even at times.
And sometimes it can even be pre-bereavement for the patient as well as for the family, because one of the very best definitions of grief that I've ever found is that it's a process of adjustment to loss and change. And in the end-of-life process, in the health changes, there are a lot of losses and changes that people experience.
Yeah, that brings up such an interesting point, just in how we use the word grief. Because typically, I think, when you say grief, people are automatically going to go to you're grieving a loss through death. But you just brought up an excellent point, so let's talk about that just for a minute. From the patient's perspective, talk about the kinds of losses that they could need some help dealing with. We talked about so I think about things as a nurse. I'm thinking maybe they've lost their independence. So we know we've got our hospice aides, our nurses, everybody to help. Maybe it's personal care. But do you ever talk with patients and families, how do they anticipate the losses that are coming just prior to the death?
For the patients themselves? I think that's more your area than mine.
Yes, like you'd said, Lynn, the loss of independence, but also the loss of role that a person has, that they've been a parent, they've been a spouse, and we usually have certain ways we fulfill those roles. As health changes, as our energy levels change, as our brain's trying to wrap itself around what's happening, how we're able to show up for the people we love can change, and there are losses there. A lot of things, I'm really glad you mentioned how often we focus on grief around the death of a person. We don't give a lot of credence to the loss of a dream, the loss of a hope. Is a person going to be able to see their child married? Are they going to be able to attend that high school graduation? Are they going to make it to their 65th wedding anniversary? And how can they begin to make peace with that if it doesn't occur?
And those are some areas that things like legacy projects are really great for. And that's an area that I might come in and also helping with the role change on the caregiver side and helping prepare for learning how to take over roles. Sometimes they're roles they've never done before. Managing a house, paying bills, learning how to do laundry. It can be life skills that their partner has always done, for example. But those legacy projects, like you'd mentioned, you know, graduations, weddings, upcoming birthdays, holidays, maybe even just pre-writing cards to give someone on that occasion, or taking a special picture, writing I love you and putting it on a pendant. There's so many things that are very personal to each family that would be done in those times.
That just made me think about so much. I immediately went to the men in my life, my dad, my husband, and how they are in their role as father, as husband. My dad in particular, we've always kind of teased him, but he's always in charge. I don't mean that in a negative way. You just knew growing up, if such and such happened, Daddy's going to take care of that, and he always has. So, but flipping that around in my head, if he were ever in a situation where he did have declining health and he loses, that is really something for the family to think about. How is that affecting him?
Exactly.
So it's not just, that is really something to stop and think about, because he will experience that loss before we experience our loss, if that makes any sense.
And do they recognize it and name it?
Right. Wow. Okay. So y'all are teaching me as we go. So let's say there's a family that we really feel like, a lack of a better word, they're grieving appropriately. That's something that we say a lot. And you call, and they really do seem to be doing okay. How do you individualize, or how do we customize, I guess, our services from family to family?
That's a really great question, because there are so many facets to deciding how appropriately somebody is grieving and what supports they may need. We might look for things like, you know, there's something we call grief symptoms. There may be physical symptoms. There may be, you know, cognitive, emotional, different symptoms we might look for. Is, you know, how are you sleeping? Do you have supports to talk to? Has this loss made a financial impact that you're struggling with? Do we need to look at actual, you know, community resources in that aspect? But if somebody has all of those bases covered, they're sleeping well, they're eating well, they have good supports, they have good, you know, coping strategies, good faith, they have all those things, then we're still there to be a listening ear and just to be someone. Sometimes you don't need counseling or therapy, but everyone needs to know they're not alone. Everyone needs somebody to talk to. And sometimes you just want to share memories. And so we're here for that too.
Yeah. The more often people are able to tell their story, it can help them make the loss more real as well. Because again, just the idea that it's so surreal in the beginning, and having a chance to talk about the person and your life together.
You know, sometimes I think in society in general, sometimes people are uncomfortable because they don't know what to say. But what I just heard you say is that it's actually helpful. It's okay to have them tell that story, tell about their person. Let's talk about them.
Over
because
and
you
over.
don't want
Necessary.
It is, yes, and you don't want to avoid talking about that as if that person did not exist. To me, then that is not honoring their memory, is how I would view that. So it's okay to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So thinking about what you just listed, you were talking about physical symptoms, and then you were talking about support systems, which would be our emotional support. You mentioned faith, a spiritual support. So as we think about the services we provide with end-of-life care, we always tell people this is holistic care. And we have a discipline, whether it's chaplain, social worker, nurse, hospice aide, you know, we got you covered, right? So we've got the physical symptoms, because we know you can't separate one from another. That's what makes the whole person. So that's an interesting way for us to also educate about grief, that response would be a holistic response. Talk about that just a little bit.
And that education piece is key, because oftentimes when people think about grief, they focus on the emotions, and they're surprised to hear that headaches, body aches, sleeping issues, appetite changes can be a part of it. Brain fog, lack of concentration. And then people start to say, oh, that's why I keep losing my keys, or that's why that's happening. And they don't realize it's the grief, which also impacts how they behave and engage with one another. They might be more withdrawn. They might have a hard time being around people. Or when they're by themselves and get so lonely, they try and connect with someone, then they get into that connection, say, well, what was I thinking? I just need to be by myself, because they just aren't comfortable in their skins because things have shifted so completely.
So, and this may not be the case, but do you see a difference? Let's say there's been a couple that has been married 65 or 70 years. And we see that and how beautiful that can be, but my goodness, that's longer than some people live, period. So I would imagine there's such a shift. I love that word, because it's not right or wrong, it's just different, right? So there's a shift in their whole identity,
Absolutely.
I would think. So how would you help somebody that are maybe encountering those differences?
So what's interesting about self-identity is how we identify is not just, what we consider ourselves, it's also how people treat us. And so in instances like that, you would really want to talk with the person. It may be individual that, one person's married 65 years and they consider, I'm married for life and I'm still married. And another person may feel very different and say, I'm now a widow, I'm no longer married. And so their identity may differ from someone else's. So it's hard to answer that without generalizing.
Sure.
But it would really we would just talk about it, explore, kind of try to see where their headspace is at and how they're feeling, about how they see themselves, talk about how others are seeing them and how they feel about that. But we also try to talk about the things that are consistent. We do talk about changes, because there is a lot of change in grief, but there's a lot that's consistent. Who you are as a person is who you are, and that's not going to change. So things like hobbies that you've been interested in, if you may have a hard time, like she had mentioned, cognitively. So there may be a time where reading, maybe you struggle with concentrating on that, but getting back to reading, you can still do. Your friends that are around, your family that's around, they're still there. So we try to balance consistency and change, so that we're not just focusing on the hard parts and just focusing on the change. We try to bring up the beauty and the supports and the strengths and the good things too.
Okay.
Well, and holding the tension from the pain of the loss, as well as looking into what's next, and not focusing more heavily on one or the other, but that can be a very hard tension to hold.
Sure.
There's the dual process theory in grief. There are a lot of theories in navigating grief, but in the dual process theory, they talk about sometimes you're kind of immersed in the grief and the experience of what this means, and then other times you're looking about the forward movement. Who am I now that this has happened, and what am I going to do with this experience?
And so those two things can coexist.
They absolutely coexist.
Yeah. Interesting to think about that, and how everybody's feeling would be, or their experience would be uniquely their experience, right? I think sometimes we have an issue in society that we just kind of generalize and just think about, I mentioned earlier, we had made some changes as an employer with our own bereavement leave, but that traditional 3-day bereavement leave, no matter who it was that you lost, that's been kind of a staple thing throughout the years. That's never really changed. So it would be easy to see how somebody might get in their head, well, golly, I should be over this in 3 days. I've got to get over, which is ridiculous.
Completely.
It is completely.
And we do. We live in a society that tries to put a timeline and tries to say, it's been this amount of time, you should be back to work, back to normal, back to just function, go, go, go. And that's not really how grief works. Grief has a lot of ups and downs. There's times where you feel like you're doing okay, and then you have a trigger comes in, and it could be a smell, it could be a picture, it could be you saw someone that resembled your loved one. There's so many things that might bring up a memory, and then you feel like you're right back to day one again. You're not back to day one, but it can feel like that for a moment. And we need to give time and space for that. And so I've been a recipient of that 3-week bereavement, and I am so thankful that we have changed that and not just had 3 days, because I can't imagine facing the loss that I had and then being able to just act like nothing had happened 3 days later.
And go on with your schedule.
Exactly. And the fact that we have made that change, because I can speak to an experience I had at an employer years ago. With my father's death, he died less than a week after I was married.
Oh,
So what was
wow.
supposed to be the honeymoon
Right.
took a slightly different turn, so we ended up being gone for 2 weeks. And the people at the time seemed to think that that was more than enough and that I should be fine and ready to just jump right back in.
Yeah.
And I wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so important for us to be able to communicate to the community that we serve that it's okay for you not
Exactly.
to be okay. You know, that sounds cliche. You read
Yeah.
that on a pillow at Hobby Lobby, so it's okay not to be okay.
But it's true.
But
It
it's
is
true.
true.
It
It's
is
true.
very true. And so, talk a little bit about, how do you communicate that to people? I realize it's not a one and done conversation, but I would imagine there are lots of conversations about process and that whole journey.
So there are times where people returning to work is a helpful distraction, and I know there's a lot of mixed feelings on distractions, but my feeling on it is that sometimes you don't need to be in your grief 24/7. A distraction is okay. Like you mentioned, there's also there's processing the grief, but also taking the steps to move forward as well. And there needs to be time for both. And sometimes having a distraction, joining a social group, joining a gym, doing something to get out of your head, out of your space just for a time is good. And so sometimes returning to work can be a good thing, but that has to be the time that is okay for that person. So that is very separate, but or very individual, I should say. But as far as well, shoot, now I forgot the question. We were on a roll.
We were on a roll. It's all right. Well, we were just talking about
I got distracted
having
because I leaned
people.
forward and
Because we're
messed up
talking about
my-
distractions.
Well, I messed up my mic and I was like, oh, shoot, and I lost focus.
It's okay. Well, we were talking about helping people understand that this is a process and it's very much a journey. So I guess as we're helping people understand that, and that may be very new information for people, I would imagine, in a lot of cases. But how would you educate somebody that, okay, here is, and this is to be expected, the waxing and the waning that we've talked about, but when should they become concerned? In other words, when should they reach out for maybe some extra support?
Do you want me to answer? So
Yeah.
that's also differs person to person.
Sure.
So there may be times where there's a holiday coming up.
Yeah.
This time of year tends to be pretty difficult for people. So holidays may be coming. There may be a special occasion, a wedding, a graduation, a birthday. So that may be weighing on someone's mind, that they're just feeling a little anxious on how am I going to get through this day? I don't know how it's going to feel, and just need to talk through that and maybe get some ideas on how it's okay to carry on traditions. Just because your loved one had passed doesn't mean that the things that you love doing with them has to stop. You can carry those on, and finding ways to do that. There could be times where maybe there was a trigger, like I'd mentioned earlier. You saw someone that made you think of your loved one and it just brought you to tears, and you want to talk through it. I've had people call me after having a panic attack in a grocery store because they saw their loved one's favorite food and they realized they weren't buying it that day. And that's really hard, and sometimes you just need to talk through that moment. Or maybe there wasn't a trigger and you just woke up and you're just, I feel sad today, I just want to talk to somebody, and that's what we're here for.
Well, and also paying attention to the fact what energy level is. That sometimes, the hobbies that we've had in the past, we aren't able to jump right back into that. And if that goes on for an extended period of time, that could be something to pay attention to.
Okay.
Or if you're not sleeping well, how long's that been going on? Really being mindful of your physical health and making sure that you're connected to a primary care practitioner.
Absolutely.
So lots of things for people to consider as they go through this journey. But what I am hearing is that there are lots of things for them to pay attention to about themselves, but that it's also a time for lots of grace for themselves.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we are in our heads and talk to ourselves
Yes.
more than we talk to anyone else. And we
Yes.
do need to be careful about the words we say to ourselves, and
Yes.
just to encourage yourself that it's okay. This is a hard day. It's going to happen. It's okay. Tomorrow can be better. And just continuously talk to yourself like you would a friend.
And just paying attention to the tone of voice you use when talking to yourself, and self-compassion, and really giving yourself permission to grieve. People that I've worked with in the past have a different grief experience than their family and friends do.
Sure.
And their family and friends have certain expectations about how that person should
Right.
grieve, and there is no should. So if we can give ourselves permission to pay attention to our experience and our needs in that grief,
And that experience is okay.
and that experience is okay.
You know, what you just said about we talk to ourselves and the tone of the voice,
Yes.
that is so important. And I know that's probably not something that a lot of us think about. But I remember reading something years ago that said, you become the stories that you tell yourself. And talking to yourself like you would a friend. But that takes intention, and that takes a lot of work on our part, right?
It does.
Me personally, I would never say to you all some of the things that go on in my own head. But that really is something that there's like, wait a minute, why am I going to be so much harder on myself than I would anybody else?
Right.
That's an interesting thought, and I think that's part of this education, is that that really shouldn't be. You know, it's an easy thing to say, well, give yourself a little grace, Christin. Much harder to actually do it, but that takes regular practice
It does.
as well.
And it takes recognizing, hearing the words like
It
should
does.
in your head when you hear yourself say that. Or, you know, one of the physical symptoms we talked about, another might be feelings of anxiety. It might not be actual panic or anxiety, but that feeling where, you know, what's going on, my breathing has changed, my heart rate's changed. But recognizing when that starts in your body, so you know how to change how you're talking to yourself to ground yourself and kind of get out of that anxious spiral, really.
Right.
But learning how to identify those words that you're saying, but those feelings that your body is also showing at the same time.
And also the frequency of how often you're talking to yourself in that manner. And maybe even noticing, is there something particular happening? And when this situation occurs, then you find yourself talking to yourself in this particular style.
So it's even more identifying what's going on at the time. That's what led to the thought or how I'm talking to myself. So lots of things that we don't typically think about during our day, but it's very important for us to be intentional with ourselves and the care that we provide. So I think two of the biggest things that I'm taking away from this conversation is there is no timeline to grieve, and there is no normal way to go through the grief experience. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. You know, there's some things I've said before that I try not to look at things as normal or abnormal, more as, is this helpful or not helpful? So there may be things like, for one person, they may visit their loved one's grave, and that's something that they find peace doing, they find connection doing, it's helpful for them. For another person, visiting the grave may be just torturing themselves, and it may be keeping them at the place of loss rather than helping them move forward. So while the act of going to a grave itself is not considered abnormal, it may be helpful or not helpful depending on the person. And so that's, you know, like you had said, that there's no typical, there's no normal. It's what is helpful. Are you functioning? Are you coping? How are you doing?
Okay. Do you all see a difference or any benefit of talking to somebody one-on-one, having individual sessions, if you will, versus a group support group, a group of people? Or I guess it just depends.
Well, we seem to keep going back to it depends, and it's individual.
That's all right.
But oftentimes when the grief is more fresh, individual can be helpful,
Okay.
because that's your space and that's your time. And whenever you may be a little further along in the journey, beginning to connect with other people, and hearing their stories, finding out what works for them. Are there similarities? How can you support one another? Because the people in the group are willing to have those conversations that a lot of other people aren't willing to have or able to have.
Right. And that's why we try to have a variety of options in the program.
Yes.
So that for times where somebody does need just individual, either a talk on the phone, individual counseling, maybe even a Zoom counseling session, we have that available. But we do have the support group for people that do want to connect with others, want to be encouraged by people that are at different levels and stages and time frames of their own grief journey. But we try to have as many options as possible to individualize, so that each person can say for themselves, you know, I don't think group would be right for me right now. I think it'd be too much, but I would love to talk to you on the phone, you know, once a week, twice a month, something like that.
Okay. And I was just thinking, I don't know that this would be the case, but for some folks, I would think as you go along this journey, and let's say you get a little bit further down the road, if it was a grief support group situation, that may actually be helping someone else, or being able to tell someone else who's maybe at the beginning of this journey, this and this, this helped me. And so that might actually bring even more healing for that person down the road.
It does. It's helpful for both involved.
It is.
You know, I always say there's healing in helping. And so those that have progressed a little bit further in their grief journey are able to kind of reach a hand back and help pull others along, which is encouraging on both sides and healing on both sides. But it also helps those that are more fresh in their grief to not feel alone. And they really want to know that I'm not alone in this. What I'm feeling is normal. Other people have been here, and other people have been through it.
You know, every podcast that we've done so far, every discipline that we've talked to, it all comes back to that human connection, which is what you just described. Even if it is a grief journey, and maybe that grief is very fresh, and you're not really into great big group activities, but at least knowing I've got this organization's there, Christin's there, Kerri's there, if I need somebody. So there's still that connection on whatever their terms are.
However they choose to use it, they know we're here.
That is awesome. So as we wrap up, is anything that we missed that you think we really need to share with the community? I think we've touched on.
We've covered a lot. It is a very complex subject and has a lot to cover, but I think we've covered most of the basics and the program that we have available here, the ways that we're able to help the families we serve, but also the community. I think that is important to know that we're here for the whole community too.
Yes. And also I think people have probably heard the theme throughout, the fact that there's not a right way to grieve.
Right.
And, you know, we human beings, we usually like to have steps we can follow, and we like things to make sense. Some of us like that more than others. And grief doesn't make sense a lot of times. And just knowing that you're not doing it right because you're not checking off boxes, because this isn't a box checking sort of thing.
Right. All of those grief theories you'd mentioned earlier, all of them are taught, I guess you could say, as if they are stages, that you go through this and then this and then this, and a lot of times it's back and forth, and you might skip one and go back to another, and it's not neat, but I keep saying you don't have to do it alone. I think that's the biggest thing, is when it feels like chaos and it feels like up and down and all over, you don't have to do it alone.
So we're going to end on that. That's the greatest statement I can think of. And how this organization chooses to care for our community. You don't have to do it alone. If you have any questions about grief, loss, or bereavement that we didn't touch on today, feel free to give us a call at 336-427-9022. You can always follow us on Facebook. You can find our website at www.hospiceofrockinghamcounty.com.